Do you know what Watergwan is? It's where you can get news about the Jamaican culture and just learn about how Jamaicans are doing, as I said, yard and abroad.
Salut tout le monde, ici Kaya La Flamme. T'aimes le reggae en français, en anglais, qui vient du Canada, du Québec et de la Jamaïque? Écoute Watergwan.
So rope in and come check out the thing now. It's Watergwan.
I live in the UK and I enjoy tuning in to Watergwan.
I am a big fan of Gwaan. I'm always looking forward for the great vibes, the great things. They discuss a lot of things that are going on in Calgary, across Canada, and of course Jamaica. So
this is what is going on in Jamaica. But check out Gwaan.
Every Friday at 7 p.m. Calgary time.
You get to learn a new Jamaican patois word or even a Jamaican phrase.
I look forward to the patois word of the day, feeding my nostalgic mood with flavor and spice. Only Jamaicans can do.
Watch Gwaan.
It happens every Friday, 7 p.m. So check them out. And bye from Toronto.
Watch Gwaan.
Yo, this is Big Shot.
Watch Gwaan.
Relevant and entertaining, so keep up the good work.
Watch Gwaan.
tune in, share, listen to Gwaan.
Big up yourself. Watergwan 2022. Bless up.
Watergwan. Yes, Watergwan.
Watch Gwaan.
Always you're going to know what go on in a yard. Check it out. 7 p.m. every Friday.
Watergwan, welcome to another edition of Watergwan. My name is Shelly, and I'll be your host this evening. It's Friday. How was your week? Good? Excellent. Thank God we have the weekend. A little thing about me. I'm passionate about aging, providing service to our older adults. And I was reflecting on some of the things we can do this weekend. Speaking to an older adult and asking them their advice. I've learned so much from just asking my aunts, my uncles, what life lessons have you learned? How you think I should approach this? And I believe as a community, we need to engage not only our peers, but also persons older than us and wiser, to ask them how they have navigated life and how we can even use their experience to enhance ours. So I know we have some cooking to do for the weekend, some cleaning, but make a phone call mommy, call daddy, call, a friend. And if you are an older adult, call the young one, ask them how they're doing. This is very crazy time that we all are going through. And I think reaching out and making it a part of our community practice is another way of building our community. And really ask them what are going on, what really are going on with you. Yeah. Ooh. So today is going to be a fantastic show. I'm so excited. We have another great discussion lined up. Pan-Africanism with Dave Austin. It is going to be superb. But we have our Jamaican word of the day. Bonononos. That is our word of the day. Please put it in the chat. What does bonononos mean? Use it in a sentence, in a phrase. Bonononos. Miss Lou, anyone? Bonononos? Come, let us hear from you. Let's keep the conversation going. Follow us on Watergwan Follow us on our Facebook or Instagram. Chat with us. Let us hear from you. Let us just start the ball rolling and have some fun. Bonononos. What does it really mean? Do you know your Jamaican words? Bonononos. All right. So our upcoming events for this week, we have in Winnipeg, Yard Vibes is hosting an all-white dance hall night on July 23rd at the Four Crowns Restaurant and Bar at 9 p.m. Dress code is in effect. Early bird tickets are on sale for $30, so get your tickets soon. Contact at Yard Vibes Promotion on their Facebook or Instagram, or you can send them an email at yardvibepromotion@gmail.com. Now, in Winnipeg, Aral Summer Jam Fest is here. The festival started yesterday and will run until Sunday, July 16th. Located at the Hilltop Resort at Grand Beach, this family friendly event will feature food, beach themed activities, vendors, live DJ, entertainment, and live local and international music. More information is available at www.irlfest.com. In Calgary, the Jamaican Canadian Association is hosting their third annual backpack distribution. Pickup is at the JCAA building while supplies last. Now contact them at 403-775-1235 or event at jcaalberta.ca for more information. Also in Calgary, Afro Caribbean Food Festival celebrating African and Caribbean culture is taking place on Saturday, July 23rd at St. Patrick's Island Park, located in downtown Calgary. This is a free, family friendly event hosted by the Yard Core Seed of Life Association. There'll be a food truck, beer garden, local crafts, community booths, live entertainment. So check out their website at www.acfoodfestival.com for more information. Again, donations are welcome. So let us just give them donations, your time, and have a wonderful experience. Now, in Toronto, the JCA celebrates Jamaica 60 with a flag raising ceremony on July 31st at 12:45 p.m. Check the JCA website at www.jcaontario.org for more location details. Join us to celebrate Jamaica's 60th independence. It will be fantastic. All right. There's a lot to do. There's a lot to do, and that is just fantastic. So, spot the place. All right. So this time we're going international because, as you all know, everywhere you go, there is a Jamaican. We take our culture with us and we influence the culture around us. I am so proud and happy to be a Jamaican. I know you too. So we have two places for you this evening. The first one is in the county of Essex, home to a castle. It has many Roman references. Do you know this place? Do you know this place? Number two, one of the most multicultural places in the UK. Eddie Grant's song is based on this avenue. Their market is known for great street food and vintage items. Can you spot this place now? Let us hear from you. Add it to the comments. Tell us where you think these are. And let us tell you if you're right or wrong. All right? So the first place, County of Essex, home to castle, many Roman references. The second one, Eddie Grant's song is based on this avenue. Their market is known for great street food and vintage items. Chat with us. Hit us up. Let us know if you really understand what's happening. So now we're going to go to my great friend Donovan. It's now time to reason.
Jerry. As I'm a bononos friend.
Oh, chama bononos. Gwaan.
Boy, I'm a day Gwaan, go and enjoy, 30-degree weather here in Calgary. So, for the people who in Jamaica and other places think that we're the only ones that have steaming hot weather. And we have a dry heat here in Calgary because we're over 3,000 feet above sea level, but it's beautiful. Absolutely gorgeous. And we have a little thing going on out here called the Stampede as well, right? It's like a cowboy show. But millions of people come and do it. So it's been going good. It's been going good.
We're having a good little heat session here in Montreal as well. It was a beautiful, glorious day. It was good to be out of the house. And Stampede, not here yet, but still a wonderful summer day here in Montreal.
All right, awesome. We're going to turn up the heat a little bit because we're going to have a great discussion here on Pan-Africanism. So I'm going to do a little reasoning with Dave.
Yes.
And I'll come back later on and we'll chat. All right?
All right.
All right, folks. Welcome again to A Time to Reason here on Gwaan. I'm Donovan. Good to have you all on board. Clarence, big up yourself and see a show to you. Prudence. Always looking for comments and feedback as well. So for all the people who are watching the show live and delayed, give us a question, give us a comment. Share it as well so that people can benefit from the discussion. Today we're going to talk about Pan-Africanism, something that has been around as a movement, a discussion for a long time. And we've got Dave Austin, who is a academic producer, writer, all kinds of things. He currently is a lecturer at McGill, and he also teaches at John Abbott College. He's an author, so he's written a couple of books. One of them I like the topic, Fear of the Black Nation, Race, Sex, and Security in 60s Montreal, which was one that he released in 2013. He does a number of other things. He produces a documentary. He's all over, and I think we're going to benefit from some of his knowledge. So let's bring him into the conversation as we talk about Pan-Africanism. Where are we now? Dave, welcome to A Time to Reason here on Gwaan. How is it going? You have to unmute though. Welcome to 2022.
Sorry, I was saying thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure. I feel like I've discovered a community that I didn't know existed.
Well, here we are.
In terms of this program.
And in real Jamaican style, the first thing we're going to do is take as much as we can from you in terms of knowledge.
Well, I just should say before we start that, as somebody of, Jamaican ancestry, but my parents are Jamaican, obviously my grandparents and everybody, and it's it's a real pleasure to be part of this conversation, also to discover your program, which I only found out about very, very, very recently. So thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for taking the time to come share some knowledge with us. And you know what, let's jump into the conversation. And maybe where we should start, Dave, is definition. For you, what does Pan-Africanism mean?
Well, that's a big question. And I think, there are probably a number of ways that we can talk about this thing called Pan-Africanism. But, I think one way to think about it or to conceptualize it and understand it is to think about it in terms of both a process and a kind of movement in many respects too. And by process, I mean, there's a way that we can think about Pan-Africanism as a moment that begins with the history of slavery in many respects. Right? Because as a result of slavery, various people from various parts of the African continent, various ethnicities and backgrounds were brought together as part of this process, right, of colonization in the so-called New World in the Americas. Right? And it's out of that process, an entire culture having been brought from the African continent, but adapting and sort of being reframed in the context of the Americas, came into being. And for the first time, you have this kind of, this combination of African people from East and West, various parts of the West African coast, largely in the case of Jamaica and most parts of the Caribbean, but also from the Congo, etc. So it's this forging of communities across the Americas, or what the Jamaican thinker Sylvia Wynter calls the kind of black metamorphosis, right? That's in some respects the first bringing together of Africans on a large scale. Right. And I'll come back to the movement part in a second, but so C.L.R. James, a Trinidadian thinker, used this term, the West Indian Road. It's along this, I meant to be the exact words, but the West Indian Road to freedom, right, passes through Africa, right? Right. So this conception of Pan-Africanism, at least the one that I'm referring to, is largely comes into being as a result of people in the diaspora, right, who are thinking and looking backwards, thinking about the African continent, thinking about their cultural identity, thinking about freedom in an entirely different context, in which to be African is to be demeaned and cast aside in relation to what it means to be European, etc. So the redemption, quote unquote, of the African continent becomes a way of thinking about Caribbean freedom and understanding Caribbean freedom. So, but my point is that, and that whole point about redemption is the movement side, where you see large numbers of people from various parts of the Caribbean and also from the United States when you take into consideration people like W.E.B. Du Bois. But I'm thinking also about people like Amy Ashford Garvey and Marcus Garvey, obviously, if you're talking about Jamaica and internationally. George Padmore, also from Trinidad. And then what happens at a certain point in the 1940s, right? You have a series of conferences that take place between early 1900 and 1945 in Europe, right? In London, Belgium, in Lisbon. But the kind of culminating conference occurs in 1945, and it's organized this time not by West Indians as the earliest ones were, or in one case, W.B. Du Bois, but by people from the African continent and from the Caribbean. So you have George Padmore, Kwame Nkrumah, Amy Ashford Garvey is involved, Nnamdi Azikiwe from Nigeria, and Jomo Kenyatta from Kenya, right? So at this point, we're no longer talking about a diasporic movement, but a movement that involves people from the African continent assuming a strong leadership role.
David, since we've gotten into the movement, and I'm glad that you've brought up some of these names, Kenyatta, Du Bois, Garvey, etc., who in many cases are heroes in their own countries in different, depends on how we define heroes. What were they trying to achieve?
Well, I think, we're talking about the history of colonization, right? And the history of colonial exploitation. And of course, alongside that, we have the emergence of what we call racial exploitation alongside colonial exploitation, right? So these were folks that were calling for the autonomy, and they were part of anti-colonial movements, right? Right. Beginning in the diaspora. But then what's interesting and unique about 1945, as I mentioned, is this coming together of West Indians and Africans. And, it's and the beginning of kind of conceptualizing right, in theory, what would happen practically on the African continent within just over 10 years. So you look at the fifth Pan-African Congress that takes place in Manchester in 1945, and then within about a space of 10 years, beginning in 1957 with Ghana, right, many African countries have gained their independence, right?
Right.
But conceptually, in terms of the framework, the model for, in terms of thinking about how that process might happen, much of that began in 1945 in England. Of course, there are other developments in other parts of, on the African continent, but also, there's a kind of Pan-African movement in its own way, and that's centered in Paris with people like Leopold Sédar Senghor, who would lead Senegal to independence, but also again involving West Indians, people like Aimé Césaire, right?
Right.
And there's one other name that I think is really important. Well, a few other names that are important to mention, because part of the Pan-African movement in England evolves in response to Italian fascism and its invasion of Ethiopia in the early 1930s. C.L.R. James and others, Amy Ashford Garvey, established this organization called the International Friends of Ethiopia, and they're mobilizing against Italian fascism. But what's also interesting is that at the same time, a woman named Elma Francois in Trinidad, but of Vincentian origin, is part of the Negro Welfare Cultural Social Association that was involved in the labor movement, among other things. She also plays a leading role in mobilizing in the Caribbean context against Italian fascism. So again, you see this kind of Caribbean connection. But then by 1945, we see this transition.
Yeah, let's go back a few years though, because there's a guy called Marcus Garvey who had a lot to say and a lot to contribute to that conversation.
Absolutely.
And some of what he was talking about spoke to not just political independence, and Garvey covered a number of different disciplines. But one of his things was economic independence as part of this whole movement. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, economic independence, but also recovering the dignity of people of African descent, right? And the two things were, I think, for him, intertwined. Robert Hill, in addition to Rupert Lewis and others, have done a great deal of work on this. But it's this idea that African and Pan-African freedom is tied to not being economically or politically dependent, for that matter, on the government, on the state, on colonial authorities, etc. So that absolutely, you're absolutely right about that. But one of the things that I think is also important to highlight about the Garvey movement, it's often described as one of the most important and biggest Black organizations to have evolved in the 20th century. But I think it's actually fair to say that it was one of the largest mass movements of the 20th century period, regardless of, which kind of ethno-racial group we're referring to. So just for an example, in addition to the number of chapters and followers in places like Jamaica, all over the United States, in a tiny island such as Cuba, you had 50 chapters alone. Right? On the African continent, you had people like members of the African National Congress and a younger Kwame Nkrumah who are reading and knowledgeable about Garvey and drawing inspiration from his newspaper, The Negro World, which was circulated by sailors, among other methods, and just by the model of this idea of Black redemption, restoring the dignity of the African, et cetera, et cetera. So there are, in many respects, Garveyism, it went well beyond the figure and became an international movement.
Right.
That inspired by Garvey's message, had chapters and almost like self-organized in multiple parts of the world.
Right.
Absolutely.
And while we're talking, I want to encourage those who are watching, if you've got questions or comments, please throw them in the comments section so we can, pick as much as we can out of Dave. This is awesome so far. Dave, let's talk a little bit about the successes. You use the word inspiration, and we're going to move into 2022. But when you look at this whole concept and from the movement side of things, what would you attribute to Pan-Africanism as successes?
It's hard to measure success sometimes. I think it's fair to say that, like, if we look at things in stages, between 1945 and the early 1960s, that represented a remarkable leap in terms of the transition from colonial subjection to independence. Right? That's a major achievement in and of itself. But I know that folks sort of look at the African continent today with weary eyes and question, what progress might mean. But I think when we look at what Walter Rodney refers to as the underdevelopment of the African continent, and we look at the level of external intervention on the African continent, right? There have been serious impediments, right, and economic disadvantages that have been imposed on the African continent. That's right. That's absolutely true, right? But then there's another point that I think is important for us to consider, and that is how, so in 1974 there was a Pan-African Congress, the sixth Pan-African Congress in Tanzania, and it was initiated again by some folks from the diaspora, but they chose Tanzania because there was a Ujama experiment under the President Nyerere, which was kind of experiment, but they refer to kind of African socialism, so to speak.
Right. Yeah.
And so it was also a place where African exiles, including from South Africa and other places, and Southern Africa, converged and found support for their liberation struggles that were ongoing.
Right.
But one of the things that happened is that the call was made by the diaspora, and there were certain people, including folks like Walter Rodney and others, and C.L.R. James, that then became concerned that some of the people that were part of that were not part of governments or states or whatever the case may be, but that were more kind of concerned about how change might come from below as opposed to above, were excluded from the conference, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I'm saying that to say that, like, I think it's also important to understand that, like, we were talking about Pan-Africanism in a broad sense, right? There are different tendencies and also interests, right? In any, just like there are in any movement, and sometimes those different tendencies can also serve as an obstacle. Right? So in James's, in the case of the Sixth Pan-African Congress, people that were not part of government agencies or not representing heads of states were largely excluded from being involved, which is kind of a reflection of kind of some of the challenges that people both in the Caribbean and the African continent were confronting once those countries had become independent. Right? The question of whether or not, in the case of the African continent, in this case, whether or not those governments sufficiently or adequately represented the aspirations of the population.
And when you talk about that, in a couple of weeks, Jamaica, Trinidad, and a number of these states will be celebrating 60 years and close to 60 years of political independence. And there's consistently the question of, have we achieved enough? How do we measure that degree of success? But I want to transition the conversation a little bit, Dave, into perception today about this concept and the movement. And I want to draw a parallel, or you to draw a parallel, with Black Lives Matter and some of the things that are happening currently. Are there similarities to the Pan-Africanism movement? Is it one builds on the other? What's the relationship in your mind?
Well, I think, if we think about Pan-Africanism as a political tradition, right, that involves the range of people that I spoke about, right, and how, in many respects, it evolved in a particular moment, at a particular stage when people in the diaspora and on the African continent were thinking about freedom, right? So anti-colonialism was part of it, but dealing with the question and the issue of race and racial terror was also part of that too. And, it's part of a line of continuity or movement that has taken different forms over time. So in a certain respect, especially in the diaspora, the new form of Pan-Africanism, in a sense, emerged in the form of what we might refer to as the Black Power movement. And in that sense, when we, and the whole kind of organizing that occurred in the 1960s and mobilization that occurred in the 1960s, which of course was also tied to anti-colonial struggles too, and inspired by the work of people like Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau, the writing of people like Frantz Fanon, etc. But in many respects, you can see the kind of trace the lineage of BLM or Black Lives Matter and various other forms of or groups or movements within the broad movement that are organizing back to the 1960s. But I think one of the things that we can say, though, as we look at the present in relation to the past, is that there are issues that have been placed on the agenda politically and culturally and socially in our time in relation to BLM that were not on the agenda in the 1960s, right? So,
Right.
We can't talk about Pan-Africanism, freedom, Black liberation, et cetera, without seriously thinking about gender today. And we
Right.
and the same comes in terms of sexuality, right? These are all issues that the movement has placed firmly on the agenda today in ways that were not front and center in the 1960s and 70s. So, it's part of the kind of evolving shape of these movements within the movement. And I think the way to see it is that each successive generation builds on what was done in the past. And it doesn't mean that you're necessarily conscious of that. It doesn't mean
Right.
that because I think people today, younger people, don't talk about Pan-Africanism, right? Right? But it's
Right.
still part of the movement and consciousness that have shaped their lives. And having said that, though, there's a Pan-African conference happening in Barbados. It's coming in the coming weeks, I think. And Sakaya Thomas is one of the people who's from Jamaica, actually, is one of the people who was involved in spearheading that. So the notion is still alive. And of course, there's still a need for it when you look at the kind of, social, economic, and political circumstances in the Caribbean context. So in our context, in the diaspora, people are not using that language today, right? But I think still
Principles are the same.
Yeah, exactly. Still drawing on some of the same, ideas and motivations, because our circumstances have not dramatically changed. In fact, you can also talk about, regression alongside elements of progression at the same time.
Let's go down that road, because I have a specific question regarding that. Because how would you assess the impact of what I call the fractures in the African political and Caribbean political structure, and the efforts at organizing collectively? How is that impacting the level of achievement of the movement?
Now, when you say the fractures, like, could you say a bit
Well,
more?
look at CARICOM, and you look at other attempts at collective approaches from independent states in the diaspora,
Well,
and the degree to which they work well or not.
Well, what I would say is that there are different conceptions of how we organize for change in general. And there are some that place emphasis on organizing from above. Right? So you mentioned CARICOM, we talk about between states, between governments, between the leadership, etc. And there are others that, people like Walter Rodney and CLR James. I think about the work of Elmer Francois that I mentioned earlier in Trinidad, who are organizing from below, premised on this idea that so-called ordinary people have the creative capacity to organize to change their lives if they're given the space to do so. Right? So it's a completely different conception of politics. And clearly what we're seeing, and it's not just in the Caribbean, not just on the African continent, but we're seeing it in North America and Europe, is that the conventional political model of government from above is not meeting the needs of the majority of the population, And, we can talk about it in terms of economically, we can talk about it socially, we can talk about it in all kinds of ways in which we live in an egalitarian society, right? So there's a way in which we need to rethink the model in terms of what we understand politics and who does politics and the extent to which, because we refer to democracy, of course, as people voting every 4 or 5 years, right? But what's the level of our participation? Right? To what extent are we engaged? And of course, like this, the implications of that for, people like us, who, people of African descent, and people who are generally sort of, who are who are generally not considered to be a priority, right? The implications are that much dire, and that much more significant. And so I think it's part and parcel of coming to terms with the reality that, given all the problems that we see happening in this world, right, the model that has been emphasized and celebrated is clearly not working for everybody, and it's not working for most people. We see, let's be honest, like we see the kind of crass inequality in terms of wealth, right, which we've seen exacerbated during the pandemic, while the rest of us, most people are in crisis. Right. That tells us a great deal about the nature of this model. Like, so people can fly to the moon in their spare time, right? Where other people are going, without food. You know what I mean? That's that's what it boils down to. So the model is problematic.
But isn't there a similar question on the model or of the movement around Pan-Africanism? There are perspectives that suggest that it is too insular and it requires more openness and more inclusion.
But in what way? I mean, in what way would folks consider it insular? I mean, Pan-Africanism, I think at its best has been internationalism, right? It's a way of thinking beyond borders, and we see that, like, this is, we see what happens when we deal with narrow forms of nationalism, right? At its worst and at its extreme, we've seen that historically it's led to various forms of fascism, right? And it's not coincidental that in the time that we're living, we're seeing, the emergence on a more public scale, right, of this kind of fascist and xenophobic tendencies. I think the idea that we think beyond borders, and the idea that there's cooperation between peoples, and I'm saying peoples as opposed to just states, on the African continent and in the diaspora, right, is an aspiration, right, that I think, it goes beyond national borders. It goes beyond the kind of insular, and it's kind of a reminder that we live in a world that exists beyond, the narrow confines of even the boundaries that we live in a place like Canada. We are very much a kind of international and diasporic people. Just look at our experience.
Right.
This Canada-U.S. border for us, for example, is always been quite porous because we have family all over the place, right? And you have people in Jamaica one day, and they're in Calgary another, or whatever the case may be. That's the fluidity of our experience historically, right? Which begins actually with, at least in the modern era, begins with the history of slavery. So I think, yes, perhaps people make that criticism because we talk about kind of quote unquote cultural Pan-Africanism, right? And there are folks who have been accused of kind of creating notions of African culture and identity and history that are insular. I mean, that's maybe a conversation to be had. But even when people make that accusation about Afrocentricity, for example, I think it's important to understand that, like, the emergence of movements, like cultural movements, etc., always exist in response to what exists, right? So it's the very act of Eurocentrism, right, in theory, in terms of history and ideas, but also in terms of practice, in political economic terms, right? That generates the response, right, in terms of the need and the importance for us claiming our identity, claiming our African identities in the plural sense, right? And it's also what gave birth to Garveyism. So, Pan-Africanism, whatever form it takes, is a direct response to the kind of insular cultural, economic, and political racism, right, that was part of colonization and the kind of, systemic forms of racial exclusion and racism that we live within in these societies. So if anything, it's the other side that's insular because it's been designed to keep us out.
So it's a response to the insularity. Let's talk a little bit, though, as we look at the clock and time goes. I mean, this has been going great. The future, and I want to talk first about leadership. You talk about the need clearly to revisit the leadership model, and we talk a little bit about the political structures. What does it need to look like for us to either be more effective or achieve more, or continue on the path that we're on?
Wow, that's a huge question. And that's a huge question, but for me, it always comes back to how do we understand the place of society's most vulnerable, and where do we see them in terms of how they fit in a more humane and just society? How are the elderly treated? What resources are made available to them? How are the young treated? How are people who are considered immigrants or refugees, the outsiders, treated? Right? And when we take all those indices, right, we see that, like, in many respects, it's an indicator of the levels of inequality that we live with in the society. I think that, I take Walter Rodney, for example, who used to, in Jamaica in the 1960s, engage in these groundings. It's called, it's based on, and you can find some of the thoughts that came out of these groundings in a book called The Groundings with My Brothers. But again, it's this idea that, ordinary people, so-called ordinary people, I even like the language of ordinary people, but so-called ordinary people, right, have the creative capacity to organize, to think, and to bring about and to transform their lives if they're given the space. Walter Rodney learned that not just from reading books, but he learned that from grounding with Rastafarians in Jamaica, right? And he learned about this conception of how you can live communally, right?
Mm-hmm.
The interconnection with people, right? Respect for, all of these things. And he also learned that from his study on the African continent, like the spirit of gerontocracy and hospitality, how you treat the elderly, how you welcome folks into your community. All of these things are, these are values that also should be an inherent part of politics.
Right.
But, again, when we think about politics in terms of this top-down model, where we just sort of engage in politics by proxy, by voting every 4 years, that model, I think, again, is broken. And, leadership needs to come from another place.
Right.
And also a conception of leadership that is tied to human collective interests and not the interests of a few, right? Because we see where that politics takes us, and we see how, political leaders historically, in a range of contexts, have been able to kind of manipulate folks, right, to vote outside of their own interests, right?
Right.
One of the things that obviously that came as a, maybe a surprise for a lot of people in the 2016 election in the United States is, right, there's a number of Black folks, right, who voted for Trump, right?
Yeah.
The number of women that voted for Trump, right?
Yeah.
So we, in ways that like defy logic, but then we realize that we've been, many of us have been socialized to act outside of our own interests, and that shows you the extent to which that model has become, in many respects, I would say, I think, politically bankrupt, right? If not even morally bankrupt, right? So we need to kind of think about politics in a very different way. That puts the interests of so-called ordinary human beings and the environment in which we live first and foremost. Right?
Mm-hmm. When we look forward, David, and this is all a gamble. How, if any, is the legacy of many of these names, the CLR James, the Frantz Fanon, the Garvey, Kenyatta, Nyerere? Are we losing out on that legacy? Is that legacy being diluted? Is it, where do you see it going as we move forward, fighting the same issues and the struggles?
Yeah, that's a big question, and it also involves making decisions around what parts of those legacies are most important, first of all. But I also think it brings us back to this idea that, I think it's, as somebody who teaches inside the classroom, I think ideas and politics and the legacies that come out of politics are very important to teach, because we learn from the past in ways that inform our present. So I think, teaching plays an important role in terms of understanding how we've arrived where we are. But I also recognize, and it kind of just tied to the point I made earlier, is that it's important for us to, while we look to the past, is not to over-venerate past figures and leaders, right? and more and shift toward thinking about, again, politics in a more collective sense. Because one of the things that we realize, when we look at the 1960s and 70s, right, is that, there's theory and there's practice in terms of how we understand freedom. And many of the folks that went back to their various countries in order to lead them through the independence struggle and the post-independence struggle, we saw this in the Caribbean, we saw this in the African continent, right? They face formidable challenges externally, right? But also face their own kind of challenges, and were not always in tune with their local populations once they were in power. Again, that gap between the aspirations of the people and what the leadership is either willing or capable of willing of doing, right? So part of understanding that legacy, right, is important in terms of not repeating the past in some respects, right? Or understanding what were the challenges that some of these folks faced,
Right.
And thinking about those challenges in relation to the present, right? So, I guess it's kind of a long way of saying we revisit the past in some respects, not just to valorize, not to valorize it, but in some respects to not repeat it in some respects, right? So we find those things, or we search for those things that can inform our understanding of the present in both positive and negative ways. And in that sense, it's all positive because we're learning about the past and to avoid some of the pitfalls, some of the pitfalls of the past. Because the past is not always romantic, right? And it's not always about heroic figures, which is not to diminish the importance of seeing folks and appreciating folks who have struggled and lived a life of struggle, and selfless struggle.
Yeah. We get one more question, David, before we have to go. You teach every I wasn't every day. I don't think you work 7 days a week, but you get a passing shot here to give one message to a group of people in the African diaspora from the lessons of Pan-Africanism. What do you think is the most important one that you'd want to share with them?
Wow, you come with these huge questions.
Yeah.
You know what I would say, actually? We come from an experience of resistance and struggle and tied to survival. And we can choose to look at the past and even the present entirely pessimistically, but there's another way to think about it, is that we struggled and survived to arrive at this point, right? And as Frederick Douglass used to say, no struggle, no progress. And I think, in some respects, the fact that, we think about what our contribution in that struggle has been to this world, regardless of what, we talk about states and governments and this, that, the other. It's we think intellectually, artistically, musically, etc. Right? Our experience, and I'm speaking in this particular instance about our experience in diaspora. Okay? That's been our contribution to this world that we live in, right? Where other areas have been blocked and we've been stymied, right? We've been forced to be creative in other ways, right? And the result of that is that kind of creativity, cultural, intellectual, artistic, in terms of literature, in terms of music, etc. That's one of our gifts to this world. So, it's not all about pessimism and nothingness, right? And we live to fight another day.
And maybe that's the line, folks. Despite all we've been through, despite the different names, we live to fight another day. And that's the last word I'm going to take from David Austin. Mm-hmm. David, thanks so much for joining us on A Time to Reason here on Watergo. This has been absolutely enlightening.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Take care.
Shelley.
Yes.
Done.
Wow. That was just rich.
Yeah,
That was
man.
amazing.
Don't.
I am, I started this conversation talking about reaching out to our older
Yeah,
adults on the
yeah,
weekend.
yeah, yeah,
And I had to write it down. He says, we have to be careful how we treat our elderly or older adults, and that each generation build on the previous generation. And again, that education, that simply is not just formal education, but hearing the stories
yeah,
from those that have gone before us, cherishing those stories, building upon that,
yeah.
is the way forward.
Don't.
We live to fight another day, and the only way we know how to do that is by hearing the stories of those who have gone before us.
Yeah, that's
Brilliant.
a few comments. Absolutely amazing. And I think, David, what was inspiring for me was the connection of the different players, all
Yes.
across the globe. I would have never considered so much internationalism, from Fanon in Brazil,
Yes.
CLR in Trinidad, Garvey in Jamaica, Nyerere in Tanzania, Kenyatta. Absolutely amazing connection, from all over the world, for issues that continue all through to today, right?
Yeah, and because I wrote, I had to write. It was just brilliant. I had to write down some stuff. He said, Pan-Africanism is internationalism.
Yeah.
And the fact that the Marcus Garvey movement is the largest mass movement of the 20th century.
Done.
I don't.
Yeah, man. Yeah, man. Big reasoning. Big
Yeah,
reasoning.
man. We see
Trust
what
me.
I go on.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
live to fight another day.
Big reasoning. Trust me.
Excellent.
So listen, mega run. But before I run, folks, especially the Jamaicans, the World Athletic Championship is on in Eugene, Oregon, which is just down the road, so from at least from Wamida, right? And I think over the next week it goes from it started yesterday through to the 24th of July. It streams all over the place, including here in Canada on CBC. My word is that there's enough jamination that is going to go on, as the Jamaican athletes will continue to do us proud.
Yes.
So on a jump on and check out the thing and make sure that we find, another reason to celebrate and live to fight another day. Plus, I want to use this and big up the Jamaican reggae girls, who this week also qualified for the 2023 World Cup in Australia and New Zealand. Only Caribbean country to do it twice, right? And in fact, now them outdo the reggae boys who went to France, right? So now the girls, boy,
Of course.
I take the lead and I rock it. Yeah, but reasons to be proud, especially as we, inch towards August when we celebrate Jamaica 60. So, big up to the reggae girls, and join in the jamination over the next week as we enjoy the World Championships of Athletics. All right, Shelly, I'm going to go back off and leave you. All right, take care and we talk.
Enough time. Bye. Thank you. Ooh, Prudence, what a Gwaan. Thank you so much for reaching out. Excellent. Prudence says, shout out to David. Good work and conversation. Of course, it was a wonderful conversation. Garfield Morgan, great discussion. You're right, Mr. Morgan. We really stand on shoulders of giants, and it is just, it's just phenomenal. We have so much foundation because of the groundation and the reasoning that we continue to have with our older adults, those who have gone before us, those whose lessons we can definitely learn from. It was a very, very interesting discussion. All right, so bonononos, word of the day. What does it mean? When you hear about bonononos, you get a sense of Miss Luna true. Bonononos, something wonderful, special, and it's something that you with lots of affection, Me and my bonononos going on a date later, or this bonononos thing that I have. It's that, and it's a Jamaican thing. It's that little extraness that we have that to give something even a little bit more. Bonononos. Yeah. So that is the word of the day. Now, Did anybody get it right? Spot the place. All right. The first place is by Colchester in the UK. S&S Caribbean Cafe. We are there. Jamaicans everywhere. So that is by Colchester in the UK. No, Healthy Eaters is by Electric Avenue in Bristol. Didn't anybody get that? No, but that's all right. Now we know. Electric Avenue in Bristol. All right, what's happening next week? Next week, it is going to be fabulous. We'll be talking about summer travels, things to know with Fiona Boyne and Angela Bennett. Be there. I'm excited. This is going to be, I just love for travel. And I am just excited to hear what these professionals will be able to tell us and to get us moving and getting out there. So join us next week on Gwaan. It has been a wonderful afternoon, evening for me. And I'm very excited to invite you to follow us on all our social media. And see you next week. Thank you so much and walk good.